A decorated officer pulls a gun on a man who never raised his voice. What happens next will shake the entire justice system to its core. This isn't just another headline, it's the moment a system finally got caught. Stay with us, because what you're about to see will challenge everything you thought you knew about authority, truth, and survival. Watch until the end, hit like if this matters to you, and subscribe so you never miss a story that demands to be seen. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue across the city streets as Julian Carter eased his black sedan onto Maple Avenue. The day had been long, another round of exhausting meetings with the state's oversight board, filled with politics, careful language, and the same resistance he had grown used to. As Director of Internal Police Oversight, Julian was no stranger to discomfort. He was used to navigating the gray areas, the power plays, and the subtle ways people avoided accountability. But as he drove home, jazz music playing softly in the background, his mind was focused on nothing more than dinner and a quiet night with his wife, Naomi. The city was winding down, the traffic thinning, and the streets still glistened slightly from a light rain earlier that afternoon. Julian wasn't speeding. He wasn't distracted. His hands were positioned neatly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Everything about his demeanor was composed, deliberate. But then he noticed it, a police cruiser merging into his lane a few blocks back. At first, he didn't think much of it. Patrol cars moved in and out of neighborhoods all the time. But after 2 turns and a mirrored right signal, his instincts kicked in. The cruiser wasn't just driving behind him. It was following him. Closely. By the time the flashing lights came on, Julian had already begun to slow down. He signaled, pulled over beneath a tall streetlight that hadn't quite flickered on yet, and shifted his car into park. His movements were calm and practiced. This wasn't the first time he had been pulled over for no good reason. As a black man, even one with a powerful title, he knew that didn't always matter. What mattered was staying composed. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed, palms up. He lowered the volume on the music and waited. No panic. No drama. Just quiet awareness. The door of the cruiser creaked open and a stocky officer stepped out. Julian recognized him right away. Officer Derek Nash. The name had crossed his desk before, twice in the last year, actually. One complaint for excessive force. Another for abuse of authority. Both cases had been closed without disciplinary action, quietly buried behind departmental politics and vague language. Now here Nash was, walking up to Julian's window with a kind of slow, intentional stride that wasn't about protocol. It was about dominance. Julian rolled the window down halfway. Nash didn't greet him. He didn't offer an explanation. He just asked for license and registration in a tone that made it clear he had already made a decision about who Julian was and how this was going to go. Julian kept his voice steady, his movements slow and clear. He let Nash know his ID was in his inner jacket pocket and moved to retrieve it. Nash didn't say much, but Julian noticed the shift in his posture, the subtle way he braced near his holster, the tension building in the air without any reason. The questions that followed weren't standard. They weren't even curious. They were accusatory, loaded, delivered with an edge that made it clear Nash wasn't there to serve or protect. He was there to control. Even when Julian calmly stated his name and position, Nash didn't react. Or maybe he did, just not in the way one might expect. There was no recognition in his eyes. Only annoyance. Only challenge. Like Julian's composure was an affront, his clarity an obstacle. And still, Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't match aggression with aggression. He just asked for clarity. For a reason. For a standard. The way he always had. But what he didn't know yet, what he couldn't know, is that this wasn't going to end like the other stops. This wasn't just another uncomfortable moment to move past. It was the spark. The beginning. And the world was about to see it all. Julian Carter could feel it in the air. The shift. That subtle, almost invisible line where a situation turns from uncomfortable to unsafe. Officer Nash had crossed that line the moment his tone changed, when the routine traffic stop stopped feeling routine. Julian had done everything right. He kept his hands in plain sight. He spoke with respect. He made no sudden movements. Yet none of it seemed to matter. Nash wasn't responding to behavior. He was reacting to presence, to posture, to a man who wasn't shrinking. And that, more than anything, seemed to agitate him. After a few back-and-forth questions that led nowhere, Nash asked Julian to step out of the vehicle. It wasn't a request. It was an order cloaked in the kind of tone that left no room for questions. Julian, still calm, asked for a reason. Not to be difficult, but because he believed in the process. He believed in the value of asking why. Nash didn't like that. His jaw clenched. His body language shifted again, this time heavier, more rigid. The tension between them wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for Julian to hear it echo in his bones. He knew this wasn't just about a stop sign anymore. Something else was unfolding. Julian stepped out carefully, his shoes touching the slick pavement with a soft thud. The rain from earlier still lingered in the air, making the street shimmer under the dimming sky. He stood tall, composed, his suit jacket barely rustling as he moved. Across the street, someone slowed their walk. A young man, earbuds in, pulled out his phone, the camera lens quietly catching the moment. Another person paused beside their car, sensing something wasn't right. The atmosphere shifted from routine to charged. Nash told Julian to place his hands on the hood of the car. The words were clipped, sharp, meant to assert dominance, not ensure safety. Julian paused, not out of defiance, but calculation. He moved slowly, deliberately, stepping forward and resting his palms on the cool surface of the hood. Then came the shove. Hard. Deliberate. Julian's chest hit the car with a jolt. It wasn't an accident. It was force. The kind meant to humiliate, not protect. Nash began patting him down, rough and chaotic, more violence than procedure. His hands dragged across Julian's back with no rhythm, no care. Julian said nothing. He let his breathing guide him. Deep in, slow out. Stay calm. Stay here. The questions Nash asked during the search weren't standard. They weren't even real questions. They were provocations. Did he have drugs? A weapon? Anything sharp? Julian answered with quiet clarity. He had nothing. No threat. No cause. Yet Nash's hands kept pushing harder, the anger in his voice beginning to rise as if Julian's calmness was a personal attack. Julian tried to ask again, what exactly had he done to warrant this treatment? But Nash wasn't listening. His mind had made its decision the moment he saw Julian, and now he was determined to turn that story into truth. Nash pushed further, accusing Julian of being suspicious, matching a vague description. A black man. Dark car. That was all it took. Julian stayed centered, asking again, for the third time, what behavior justified this escalation. That's when it happened. Nash snapped. His voice raised, not in authority but in frustration. He told Julian to move again, more aggressively this time, and Julian could feel it. The shaking in Nash's voice, the way his hand hovered just a little too close to his holster. The script he usually relied on wasn't working, and that scared him. Then, without real warning, Nash drew his weapon. He pointed it directly at Julian's chest, his arm locked, his breathing short. The people across the street gasped. One woman dropped her shopping bag. Another whispered into her phone. A teenager live-streaming mouthed disbelief. Julian stood completely still. His hands raised slightly, open, visible. Not in surrender, but in clarity. He spoke softly, firmly. He identified himself again. Director of Internal Police Oversight. State credentials. High clearance. Nash didn't blink. He shouted for Julian to keep his hands where they were, already spiraling past reason. Julian remained unmoved. He knew that any sudden motion could end him. He also knew that Nash wasn't hearing his words. He was hearing a challenge. A man like Julian, calm and composed, threatened the illusion of control Nash had built his authority around. That's when Julian made the choice. The kind of choice that's made not out of ego, but out of survival. In one swift, trained motion, he stepped in, slapped the inside of Nash's wrist, deflecting the gun upward. His body shifted with precision. Left hand controlling the weapon, right shoulder pressing into Nash's midsection. Nash stumbled, not expecting resistance, and Julian used the momentum, locking Nash's gun hand against his chest, disarming him without a single strike thrown. They hit the ground hard, Nash landing first, Julian following through with control. There was no fight left in Nash. Not in that moment. The weapon slid away across the wet pavement. Julian didn't hit him, didn't scream, didn't gloat. He just held him there. Steady, breathing, alive. And for the first time in the entire encounter, Officer Derek Nash finally looked like the one who felt out of control. Tyler Grant had no idea when he pulled out his phone that afternoon that he was about to record a moment that would shift an entire city. He just finished grabbing a sandwich from the corner deli and was on his way back to his apartment when he noticed the interaction across the street. A black man in a suit was being patted down on the hood of his car by a white officer. At first, Tyler hesitated. He wasn't the type to jump into other people's business. But something about the officer's body language made him pause. The pressure in his stance, the way his hand kept hovering near his weapon, the tension that hung in the air like something about to snap, it didn't feel right. So, without a word, he hit record. From that point on, everything happened fast. Tyler held his phone steady, capturing the shift in the officer's tone, the sudden aggression, the drawn weapon. His heart raced as he watched the man in the suit stay completely still, his voice calm, his hands up. There was no threat. No sudden movement. Nothing that justified a gun in his face. And when that man took control, swiftly, clearly, without violence, it was like the air cracked open. The officer was on the ground. The weapon disarmed. And the man, later identified as Julian Carter, stood firm, holding the situation together with nothing more than calm control. Tyler didn't stop recording. Not when backup arrived. Not when Julian calmly explained his role in the state government. Not when the officer was restrained, shouting wild claims into the rain-soaked street. Tyler streamed everything live. His follower count wasn't huge, maybe a few thousand people, but within minutes, that number started climbing. Viewers shared the video instantly, tagging friends, news pages, community leaders. It moved faster than Tyler could even process. By the time he got back to his apartment, the clip had already been reposted across multiple platforms. Hashtags were trending. The comment sections exploded with disbelief, support, anger, and a shared need to do something. By nightfall, Julian's name was everywhere. People were calling him a hero, a protector, a man who kept his head when most would have lost it. Others couldn't believe this was how someone with power was treated. What did that say for those who didn't have a title or a badge? The video was dissected frame by frame. Analysts noted how Julian never raised his voice. How his posture never turned aggressive. How every movement was deliberate and careful. They compared it to the officer's actions. The escalating tone, the drawn weapon, the refusal to acknowledge Julian's position even after being told directly. News outlets picked up the story within hours. What began as a live clip from a neighborhood sidewalk became a full-blown media storm. Local reporters interviewed residents from the area. Civil rights groups issued statements. Politicians scrambled to understand what had happened before being asked about it live on camera. But most of all, regular people reacted. They commented. They posted. They shared their own stories, times they'd been profiled, spoken to with disrespect, or treated like threats for doing nothing but existing. Protests formed almost overnight. Small gatherings at first, quiet vigils, people holding signs outside precincts, candles lined up along courthouse steps. Then bigger crowds came. They weren't just demanding justice for Julian. They were demanding change. Accountability. A system that listened before it punished. People carried signs with Julian's name on them. Others with messages like, "Calm is not a crime," and "Ask before you aim." Tyler's footage played on loop on giant projector screens, in community centers, at city council meetings, even in schools. Meanwhile, Julian stayed silent. He hadn't made a public statement. He hadn't appeared on television or posted anything on social media. His face was everywhere, but his voice was nowhere. And maybe that made people pay even more attention. Because they saw everything they needed to see in the footage. It was raw, honest, unfiltered. There was no spin, no confusing angles. Just the truth, captured in real time by a young man who trusted his instincts. For Tyler, it was overwhelming. He started receiving hundreds of messages a day, some supportive, others threatening. Offers came in from media companies, news outlets, people wanting exclusive rights to the clip. He turned them all down. He said it wasn't about clicks or money. He just wanted people to see what he saw. And they did. In a world full of noise, that video cut through like a lightning bolt. It reminded everyone what's possible when the truth isn't just spoken, it's recorded. And once it was out there, nothing could take it back. Not denial. Not spin. Not even silence. The truth was out, and the world had seen it. Julian Carter didn't expect the fallout to come so fast, or so quietly. Just days after the traffic stop, while the public was still sharing the video and calling for change, something behind closed doors had already started shifting. Files went missing. Access to cases he had been overseeing for months was suddenly revoked. His login credentials returned errors. Requests for clarification were met with vague responses or total silence. The system wasn't collapsing. It was retreating, closing ranks. And it didn't take long for Julian to realize what was happening. They weren't just trying to contain the damage. They were trying to erase it. It started with an internal memo from the commissioner's office, neutral on the surface, full of official language about preserving the integrity of ongoing investigations. But Julian knew what that meant. It meant they were pulling everything he touched out from under him. Every case he had worked on, every report near completion, every misconduct file he had been tracking, all reassigned to other hands, ones less likely to follow through. What had once been an active effort to confront abuse was now a carefully orchestrated pause. A freeze disguised as protocol. At first, he tried to work through it. To push for access, to file appeals. But the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. Designed to protect itself. And Julian had become a threat, not because he had done something wrong, but because he hadn't stayed silent. He had been caught doing the right thing, and for a system built on quiet complicity, that was more dangerous than any crime. It was around this time that Sergeant Elena Ruiz reached out. She had already been suspended under suspicious circumstances, supposedly for procedural violations. In truth, she had started asking too many questions. Elena had always been sharp, the kind of officer who stayed late, combed through reports twice, and didn't flinch when truth came knocking. Now she was off duty, but not out of the fight. She arranged to meet Julian at an old storage facility where the department used to keep inactive files. It wasn't under surveillance anymore, which made it the perfect place to talk. When Julian arrived, Elena was already there, seated at a desk with a laptop open in front of her. She didn't waste time. She showed him a spreadsheet, simple on the surface but packed with meaning. Names, badge numbers, timestamps, internal flags. It was a list of officers marked for discreet monitoring, not public investigations, just quiet reviews. Most had multiple complaints. Some had involvement in excessive force incidents. A few had names that Julian already recognized, flagged in his own work. And there, midway down the list, was Derek Nash. Julian's chest tightened when he saw the name. It wasn't a coincidence. Nash had been watched, tracked. Not officially, but enough to raise concerns. Enough to put him on a watch list. But nothing had been done, because Nash, like others, had protection. Files had been closed. Complaints had disappeared. And now, after everything, the department was trying to make sure no one could see just how long they'd known. Elena slid a flash drive across the table. On it were audit logs, access overrides, and proof that complaints had been dismissed not for lack of evidence, but by deliberate decision. Internal reviews had been diverted. Statements redacted. Witnesses discouraged from pursuing further action. The files didn't just implicate Nash. They outlined a pattern, a structure, a quiet design built to absorb impact without ever making a sound. Julian brought his own drive too. It held the last batch of cases he'd been working on before his access was cut. Civilian testimonies, body cam requests, timelines of misconduct that hadn't yet been tied together, but all pointed to the same truth. There were others. More names. More stories buried just deep enough to avoid public light. And now those files were sitting in front of him, not just as data, but as weight. It was no longer a question of if there was a cover-up. The only question left was how far it reached, and how long it had been allowed to grow. They sat there for a while, the room filled with that kind of silence that settles when both people understand the stakes. No need for drama. No need for speeches. Just two people, two drives, and the growing knowledge that they were holding the map to something far bigger than either of them expected. The only thing left was what to do with it. And they both knew it had to be more than just survive the moment. It had to be about exposing the whole machine. The pressure didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like a wave gathering momentum in the distance, easy to miss until it was too close to stop. At first, Julian thought the silence from the department was the worst of it. The passive shutdown of his access, the quiet rerouting of his investigations, the careful removal of his name from internal communications, it all felt like an attempt to disappear him without saying the words. But then the retaliation started taking shape in ways that couldn't be ignored. It began with Naomi. She received a message on her private social media account from someone she didn't know. It wasn't threatening in the traditional sense. There were no insults, no slurs, no vulgar language. Just a single photo, her, leaving her office, holding a case file in one hand and her phone in the other. The message attached said to watch where she walked. No signature, no profile photo, nothing else. It was vague but chilling. Not a threat designed to make her panic, but a warning meant for Julian. They were watching, and they wanted him to know it. Naomi didn't tell him immediately. She waited until their son was asleep and the house had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. When she did show him, Julian didn't flinch, but something in his eyes hardened. He knew what this meant. They weren't just trying to shut him down within the department. They were trying to make him feel it at home, where it would hurt the most. The young man who had filmed everything, the one whose quick instinct had turned a routine walk home into a turning point for the city, became a target too. His phone glitched during a call one evening. When he checked, half his camera roll was gone. His Wi-Fi had been accessed remotely. His cloud storage had been locked without his permission. His GPS had turned on by itself. It was subtle, surgical, but it was enough to shake him. Tyler called Julian in a panic. His voice was quiet, not because he wasn't scared, but because the fear had settled into something deeper, uncertainty. He kept saying he didn't do anything wrong, that he only filmed what happened. But Julian knew better. The truth, when caught on tape, comes with a price. And Tyler was starting to feel it. Through all of it, Julian kept moving forward. He checked their home security system twice a night. He started taking different routes to work, even though his authority within the department had been effectively erased. He coached Tyler through setting up new encrypted backups, offered support to Naomi as her own speaking engagements were cancelled without explanation. Every day came with a new challenge, a new subtle threat, a new reminder that telling the truth was not free. But what hit the hardest wasn't the online noise or the camera crews or the anonymous messages. It was the silence from people he had once called colleagues. People he had mentored. People who had promised to stand for the same things he did. They didn't call. Didn't write. Didn't reach out. Their absence spoke louder than any headline. Still, Julian didn't break. He didn't lash out. He didn't run. Because somewhere in the middle of all the chaos, he understood something fundamental. The system wasn't afraid of scandal. It was afraid of survival. His survival. Tyler's. Naomi's. If they made it through this with the truth still intact, the whole house of cards might fall. And so the threats came, not to destroy him, but to wear him down until he let go. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. Because if the cost of silence was safety, then maybe the risk of truth was the only way forward. The steps of the State Oversight Committee building had seen a lot over the years. Policy debates, press conferences, moments that felt big but faded fast. But when Julian Carter walked up those steps, it wasn't with fanfare. No entourage. No carefully planned entrance. Just a man in a simple gray suit, holding a folder filled with documents no one had ever expected to see in public. The truth he carried wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a system that had built walls around accountability and painted them the color of procedure. Inside, the hearing room was packed. Not just with officials and media, but with regular people. Families, teachers, retired officers, community leaders, and just everyday folks who had seen the video, read the headlines, felt something crack inside them and decided to show up. There was an electricity in the air, not loud or chaotic, but tight, like everyone in the room was holding the same breath. When Julian took the stand, he didn't speak with anger. He didn't posture or raise his voice. He just told the story, moment by moment, with a quiet steadiness that made every word land. He walked them through the night he was pulled over. How he followed every instruction. How the questions changed tone. How the gun was drawn. How he acted only when he truly believed he wouldn't survive unless he did. He made it clear, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about a pattern. One he'd seen not just as a black man on the street that night, but as the director of internal police oversight for the past 6 years. Then came the evidence. Unredacted memos, internal flags, time-stamped override logs. Documents that showed complaints had been dismissed without review. Cases closed within days. Body cam footage marked as corrupted, but later revealed to be manually deleted. At the center of it all, a name that had appeared again and again, Officer Derek Nash. And above his name, the authorizations. The signatures. The approvals. Commissioner Walter Briggs. The man who had once praised Julian for his discretion and loyalty was the same man who had signed off on every cover-up. Julian held up one sheet after another, showing them to the panel, to the cameras, to the world. There was no performance in it. No dramatic pauses. Just the weight of facts, finally laid bare. For the first time, people saw the system not as an abstract failure, but as a paper trail. One that led straight to the top. Naomi Carter followed him. She hadn't prepared a speech. She didn't need one. She spoke from the heart, about what it felt like to receive threats for standing by her husband. About watching their son try to understand why people outside their house were yelling. About the fear that had crept into their quiet life like a fog and refused to lift. But she didn't stop there. Naomi reminded the room that survival shouldn't be a triumph. It should be the baseline. She spoke not just for her family but for every family who didn't have a title to protect them, who had buried their pain in silence because they thought no one would listen. Then came Sergeant Elena Ruiz. Her voice, usually measured and restrained, carried a sharper edge that day. She laid out her findings like an investigator laying down puzzle pieces. The audit logs. The deleted footage. The cases rerouted right before disciplinary reviews were scheduled. She named names. Showed patterns. Connected dots. And when asked why she spoke up, her answer was simple. Because not saying anything had started to feel like betrayal. Tyler Grant was the last to testify. He wore the same nervous energy he had on the day he called Julian, unsure if he'd made things worse or better. But when he spoke, the room leaned in. He talked about what he saw. About why he pulled out his phone. About how he knew, instinctively, that something wasn't right. And then, through a shaky breath, he said what stuck with everyone. That he thought he was recording the last few seconds of a man's life. And that he was terrified no one would believe it if he didn't hit record. As the hearing closed, there wasn't applause. There wasn't shouting or chants. Just silence. A deep, honest, heavy silence that came from knowing something had shifted. The truth had been spoken. Fully. Clearly. Publicly. And for the first time in a long time, the system had to sit and listen. Not to defend itself. Not to spin. Just to listen. 12 days after the hearing, the verdict came down. It wasn't drawn out or clouded in confusion. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before delivering what felt, to so many, like the first real breath of justice in a long time. Officer Derek Nash was found guilty on all counts: assault with a deadly weapon, attempted manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and falsification of law enforcement records. There were no dramatic outbursts, no scenes in the courtroom. Nash sat still, shoulders slumped, eyes low, while the guard next to him quietly clicked a set of handcuffs into place. The same officer who once stood towering over Julian Carter with a gun drawn now walked out of the courtroom through a side door, not with authority, but in custody. Julian didn't smile. Neither did Naomi. There was no celebration, no cheering. Only the quiet recognition that a line had finally been drawn. For Julian, justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about one man going to jail. It was about a system that had, for once, been forced to hold itself accountable. And that meant more than just a conviction. It meant real change. The city wasted no time responding. The very next week, the council held an emergency session, not to talk around the issue, but to act. The pressure was too loud to ignore, citizens showing up in numbers, stories being shared, the video still circling, the testimony still echoing. And so, for once, instead of delay, there was movement. They passed a sweeping reform package. First, they created an independent civilian oversight board, truly independent, with subpoena power, full access to departmental records, and no ties to internal politics. These weren't appointees from inside the circle. These were community-elected voices with the authority to dig deep and make real recommendations. Next came the use of force review mandate. Every incident involving physical force, no matter how minor, would now require an automatic, third-party review. No more delayed investigations. No more disappearing paperwork. Each case would be entered into a public-facing database, with updates visible to the people most impacted. But maybe the most symbolic, and perhaps most powerful, was the real-time upload policy. All dashcam and bodycam footage would now be required to upload directly to an encrypted, cloud-based system within 60 seconds of recording being stopped. It removed the excuse of technical glitches. It erased the gray areas. If something happened, the record would be there. Unedited. Unfiltered. Unreachable by those who might try to manipulate it. The union pushed back, of course. Statements were issued. TV interviews aired with retired officers warning of overreach and handcuffed policing. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Not after everything they'd seen. The tide had turned, and no one was willing to look the other way again. As all this unfolded, Julian stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He gave one brief interview, thanking the community, acknowledging the courage of Tyler and Elena, and honoring the many families whose stories had never reached the courtroom. But after that, he stepped back. Not because he was done, but because he knew the work didn't need a spotlight. It needed space. Healing. Rebuilding. Naomi, on the other hand, stepped forward. She became a strong and steady voice in civil rights spaces, pushing not just for follow-through on the reforms, but for broader action across counties where cameras still didn't roll and silence still won. She spoke with grace, with fire when needed, and always with clarity. Her voice reached people. It made them feel something. It made them believe change was possible. Tyler went back to work at the small tech repair shop, but he wasn't the same. He started a small community project called See It Through, helping young people learn how to safely record, report, and speak out. He didn't consider himself an activist, but the truth was, he became one anyway. And Elena? The same week Nash was sentenced, the department quietly reversed her suspension. A week later, she was promoted, officially stepping into a new role focused on transparency and accountability. She didn't celebrate. She went right back to work. Because that's who she was. The city didn't throw a parade. There were no banners or official slogans. But something had changed. Not just in policy, but in people. The silence that once protected everything had been broken, and in its place was a voice that couldn't be ignored anymore. A voice made up of calm strength, quiet courage, and the steady truth of a man who chose to stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd never been seen. The trial was over, but the work wasn't. For all the headlines, the news cycles, and the viral clips, what came next wasn't about noise. It was about rebuilding. Quietly, patiently, with intention. Julian Carter didn't return to the oversight board. He didn't accept any of the national offers that came in, consulting jobs, speaking engagements, even book deals. He didn't want to become a symbol, not in the way people sometimes expect after a public moment. What he wanted was something real, something lasting, something that reached further than applause. So he opened a small training center just south of the river. It had once been an auto garage, with worn tile floors and big open windows. Nothing fancy. But Julian had it cleared out, repainted, and turned into a space where the next generation of officers, and the community they served, could come together. It wasn't a police facility. It wasn't a community center. It was both. A place where stories could be shared, trust could be rebuilt, and questions could be asked without fear. He called it the Justice Workshop, though the name never appeared on a big sign. Just simple white letters on the front door and a hand-painted quote on the wall inside about the weight of authority and the strength of integrity. He taught 2 evenings a week, never more. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. He listened. And when new cadets or even seasoned officers showed up, they weren't greeted with rules but with stories. His, theirs, the ones that were still hard to tell. People came expecting instruction. What they found was space. Space to think, to rethink, to understand how much responsibility comes with a badge and how quickly trust can be lost if that responsibility is misused. Naomi stepped into her own version of rebuilding too. After her speech on the courthouse steps, her voice had become a beacon for people who had long felt unseen. She took on cases other lawyers had turned down: housing discrimination, school bias, small-town departments still operating with little oversight. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing fairness. One file at a time. And when she came home late, tired but focused, she'd sit with Julian over dinner and talk not about the weight of it all, but about the little wins. A tenant who kept her home. A student who got a fair hearing. A family that finally felt heard. Meanwhile, Tyler Grant kept doing what he'd always done. Fixing phones, replacing cracked screens, helping neighbors get their tech back in working order. But on the side, with support from a local grant, he launched something called See It Through. It was a grassroots media literacy program that met in schools, community centers, even barbershops. He taught kids how to document what they saw, how to ask questions, and how to protect themselves when speaking up. He didn't call himself a leader, but everyone else did. And he never argued with them. Elena Ruiz stepped into her new role with quiet determination. When the governor appointed her as the new police commissioner, there was no parade, no ceremony. Just a clean office and a long to-do list. She started by opening the complaint intake logs. Then she replaced the Internal Affairs Review Board with a mixed panel, half officers, half civilians. She showed up at roll calls. She asked her own people hard questions. Some respected it. Some resisted it. But she didn't slow down. She didn't make grand speeches. She made structural changes. Ones that would outlast her title. And the city, once braced for unrest, settled into something it hadn't known for a long time: momentum. Not the kind that comes with marches or protests, but with daily shifts, officers choosing to listen longer, citizens choosing to speak without fear, schools inviting in programs about rights and responsibility, department meetings starting not with stats, but with conversations. Julian watched it all from a quiet place. He didn't need recognition. He had walked through fire and chosen not to be hardened by it. What he carried now wasn't bitterness. It was belief. That change doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from standing when you're most tired, speaking when silence is easier, and building something better, brick by quiet brick. He stood outside the Justice Workshop one evening, the lights low behind him, the air still and soft after rain. He looked out over the street, ordinary, peaceful, alive in the small ways that matter most. And for the first time in a long time, Julian Carter felt something deeper than relief. He felt hope. Not because everything was fixed, but because people had finally stopped looking away. There are moments in life when doing the right thing comes at a cost, but those are often the moments that define who we truly are. Julian Carter's story reminds us that silence in the face of injustice may protect us for a time, but it allows the problem to grow unchecked. Standing up for truth, even when it's uncomfortable or dangerous, can break cycles of fear that have silenced generations. For older audiences who have seen decades of change, both real and superficial, this story is a reminder that lasting change doesn't come from noise, it comes from courage, clarity, and quiet persistence. Whether it's speaking out in a community meeting, standing by a loved one, or simply choosing to document what others ignore, our small actions ripple further than we think. And perhaps the most powerful lesson here is that it's never too late to hold a system accountable or to help build one that reflects the values we spent our lives believing in. If we don't protect the truth now, what legacy will we leave for the next generation? If this message resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson stood out most to you, and what kind of stories or topics would you like us to explore next? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that matters. Your voice helps keep this conversation going.